Good.
Meeting. This is the same thing we saw this morning, right?
Yes.
Only different binder.
Good evening. Welcome to the May 10th, 2023 meeting of the Town of Southampton Conservation Board. In accordance with the Town Board's adoption of Local Law Number 14 of 2022, the board's meetings are being held both in person at Town Hall and via video conference through Zoom webinar. The link to participate in this meeting via video conference can be found on the town's website at the Town Clerk's Agendas and Meetings portal. You can also watch the live stream video and submit written comments for the public record through the town website. If you are attending via Zoom and wish to speak during this meeting, then please raise the click hand icon. As a reminder, to all applicants, agents, and members of the public who wish to speak at this meeting, please state your name and Hamlet of residence for the record. Thank you. And now I invite everyone to rise for the salute to the flag. To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. What is your pleasure on the minutes of April 26, 2023?
Move to accept.
As written or amended.
It's
Second.
been moved and second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Public hearings A019131, Lynn Prue Revocable Trust, and this is the hearing which is requested to be adjourned to June 28th.
What's the
Is-
reason for the adjournment? There are 10 so far, and that's getting double digits. I start getting annoyed.
The applicant's agent has indicated that he's in the process of submitting a revised plan and that we should receive that plan shortly.
Any more adjournments aren't going to be looked on favorably.
Is there anyone in the public who'd like to speak in this application before we adjourn it? Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? A022039, Helga Wymeyer.
This is a new public hearing. I did review the original affidavits of posting and mailing. The board does have jurisdiction to open the hearing.
Thank you.
Harry, I'm recusing myself.
Okay. Are you the agent? Or who's presenting? Okay.
Thank you.
Excuse me for reaching.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is John Armentano. I'm an attorney with Farrell Fritz. We represent the applicant tonight. You may have these in your packet already, but I brought extras because we're going to be discussing some of these. There should have been a submission, but these are in addition to that. These were previously submitted, so I'll just hand them up.
They just have to be stamped
Stamped.
before they give them to us.
I think we,
And
We
can
already-
you sign in on the sign-in sheet when you're done?
which one is this?
It's 48 by 12.
Do we have those?
Got like 7 copies of the staff report in there. which are coming tomorrow. 27, 27. April 26.
Oh, wow. Look at this. This is about a driveway over here.
Put the ending
cab. So this is one of the things that we passed.
Sanitary. Two copies of this dated April 27.
Keep that over there for you guys.
We're gonna be getting more.
I'm already familiar with it. Go ahead when you're ready.
Sure, and I'm also here tonight with Chuck Bowman from Land Use and Ed Corby from PW Grocer. And as you're aware, this property is located at 151 Seascape Lane in Sagaponic. We were previously, or the applicant was previously before you for a different application with a larger structure that was presented. As part of the materials that are being submitted is the resolution that was adopted on September 8th of 2021. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It speaks, I think, one of the important aspects of this decision was, it's the first whereas on the second page, which discusses that, in essence, the board was looking for a minimum house size of 1,000 square feet, knowing full well that the area is compromised with wetlands in the area, but that this was the minimum variance that would be granted by this board. The applicant proposed a structure that was larger than that. It was subsequently denied, as that decision reads. But we're here tonight to revisit an application which complies with the board's request of a 1,000 square foot house. We will speak in more depth by the experts about the environmental issues as well as the engineering issues and the issues regarding groundwater and drainage. So tonight we're taking a step forward, we hope, in that this application is looked upon favorably by this board. As we discuss the issues that have been raised by Marty Shea, we have responded to those requests and comments. I think it may be better if you hear more from Chuck Bowman at this point, and then I can address any pertinent legal matters that may come up. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, and staff, of course. I think we've come a long way on this project. It's a very complicated lot, as the board well knows, and I don't intend to go through everything we went through for the last application, because I think the board is certainly familiar with it. The most important facts are that we did reduce the house to the 1,000 square foot minimum. Marty had written a pretty comprehensive preliminary advisory report dated March 22nd, 23. Hopefully we have answered his questions and submitted new plans that address many of those questions. If I could just briefly go through them. The amount of fill that's involved in this project, the net fill, is 37 cubic yards, pretty minimal. There were certainly questions about the drainage and especially being able to put in the utility lines. I think Marty's preliminary report, basically indicated from our original plans that it was going to be a much deeper trench. Ed from PW Grocer will address those, but right now the trenching of the driveway is really 0.8 of a foot and will not require any dewatering. The only dewatering that will be required on this site now is very temporary for the IA system. That dewatering would only occur over 3 days, timed to a period where Sag Pond Inlet is open, so the groundwater levels are at the lowest level, which certainly is not a problem for us to do. And over 3 days, the calculations are about 18,000 gallons, which would then be pumped into a containment vessel, which would then be put into the drainage structures there after turbidity tests were made and made sure that, that the water was clean going into the drainage structures that are part of the house that have not changed. The buffer areas remain the same. I think we're certainly open to any other engineering items, but, you know, I mean, this project has been, when I say engineered and then re-engineered and re-engineered again, the sanitary systems are 90 feet away, from the wetland boundary. I'm sorry, 82.9 feet, close enough. Dry wells are 90 feet away. The house is 58.6 feet away. Again, that increased a bit over the previous plan because the house got smaller. The last house, if I remember correctly, was 37 by 37. This is 31.5 by 31.5. The parking areas have been reduced to the bare minimum with parking under the house. The construction of the driveway, I think I'll let P.W. Grosser explain. That was one of the questions on how it was going to be built, what kind of materials were going to be within the driveway, and how we were going to prevent building the driveway without impacting the wetland. Just so the board is aware, which I'm sure you are, as you come in off of Seascape at the cul-de-sac, that is the closest portion of where the wetlands comes into Seascape. I think every care has been taken to make this project compatible. Minimum size permitted by zoning, maximum setbacks from the wetlands, maximum setback for the sanitary system, an IA system, and in that note, I know that there are objections from the neighbors. And quite frankly, all the neighbors have lawns going down to the pond and no IA systems. I know that has nothing to do with this application. It's just putting it in context to that neighborhood. I think this particular project is certainly trying to do what's good. No lawns, there is no lawns. There's no ornamental landscape on this project, as opposed to all the neighbors who have lots of ornamental landscaping and are heavily fertilized. So, with that being said, I mean, I think the board obviously is familiar with the last application. It's pretty much the same, except we try to make improvements, tighten things up, make the house smaller, and try to answer Marty's questions that were in his preliminary advisory report. So I'd like P.W. Grosser to come by and maybe go point by point through the engineering changes that have taken place, which I think make the project better.
Thank you.
Ed?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Edmund Kirby, on behalf of P.W. Grosser. This letter was addressed to Mr. Martin Shea on April 21st, 2023. And so I'd just like to go through and address the responses based on the attached revised plans that you guys have in front of you as well. First comment, sheet C101 was updated with revised cut and fill volume, specifications in cubic yards as well as cubic feet. Number two, fill breakdowns and calculations have been updated on sheet C101 to identify these materials required for the entirety of the driveway. Number three, P.W. Grosser would like to clarify that the proposed water line shall be installed under the driveway at 4.5 feet below grade. The electrical line shall be installed under the driveway at 2.5 feet below grade, and that the total depth of the driveway shall be 2.25 feet in depth. The water line will be installed approximately 9.6 inches or 0.8 feet below the water table, but will not require dewatering. The water line trench will be filled with 1 to 2 inch of gravel to support the pipe. Once the pipe is installed, the trench will be backfilled with said gravel. The gravel is self-compacting and therefore will settle within the groundwater to provide support for the pipe. The proposed trench for the water line is approximately 2.4 feet deep, 2.0 feet wide. PWGC proposes that the driveway consists of 12 inches of compacted subgrade, either reused from cut material on site or imported. 12 inches of compacted subgrade, either reused from cut material on site or imported. 12 inches of aggregate ash stone, number 1 stone, and 3 inches of top course class 1 stone.
Excuse me.
we don't normally have you read an entire letter like this. It's going to take all night if you do.
Understood.
If this is in our file and it's, we don't need to go to that much detail at the meeting. Just so you know, I really don't want you to read this whole thing.
No, no problem. My
Nothing
apologies.
personal, but
Okay. Understood. So, going back to what Mr. Bowman was saying, we've addressed comments we feel in full. Dewatering is at a minimum. The driveway won't require dewatering for installation, which was one of the main aspects. And we updated the dewatering plan to include containment solution instead of other items, so.
Could you just elaborate what you're gonna do? You're gonna dig a trench. Could you give us an idea of the width and the depth?
Yes, sir. So the driveway will be benched.
Your name is Brian?
Eddie Kirby. So,
Eddie?
Yeah,
I'm George, Ed. Okay.
thank you. So the driveway is going to be benched down. So initially, it's going to be cut down to where the water line will go in, and the water line will be about 2.5 feet deep and 2 feet wide. The trench for where the water.
Okay,
water
so
line
you're
will be
going
installed.
down, you're gonna dig a trench 2.5 feet deep, not deeper than that?
Below the driveway, which is about 2.25 feet deep.
Okay. And 2.5 feet wide?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then you're gonna set the water?
Yeah,
Then-
the water line will be installed.
Okay, and then you're gonna fill that, and then you're gonna put the electric in?
Correct.
Okay, and then what are you gonna do after that?
The rest of the driveway will be installed.
Okay. What can you tell us about the angle? When you get to the angle,
Because it's going to be trenched, it'll be installed with regular bends as it's being put in, which is typical practice.
okay, and this is why you're trenching it because of that, right?
Correct.
Okay. Is there anything else you think you should clarify for us?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, if I could, George, I think one of the, to make it brief, one of the suggestions in Marty's looking for alternatives was why it couldn't be directionally drilled. you
Right.
know? Directionally drilling is, one, extremely expensive, and two, making bends like we are is very difficult. And
Okay.
we've done a lot of work with directional drilling over the years with different companies. And on a small residential project, one, it's too expensive, two, you can't make the bend. There was also talk about having a bridge. I still don't exactly know where that bridge would go to or how it would be. But I believe Marty may have been talking about up near the cul-de-sac, because that seems to be where the closest spot is to the wetland line. But again, my experience with bridges, I've done one in 40 years, and you have to have the bridge be able to support a fire truck weight, and it's very expensive, very difficult, and structurally, I don't think it's feasible for this type of dwelling. I don't know if the board has any more questions.
Would
from-
you
from me.
address, I'm looking at this,
C-101.
C-101,
Okay.
and I see that there is a slight incursion at the cul-de-sac, or just inside of the cul-de-sac, in from the cul-de-sac, of the wetland line that protrudes into the driveway area.
Yes, and that's what I was alluding to before. That's where I think Marty was talking about. I went out there today and looked again and see what that incursion would look like. Is it possible that we would be incursioning on that small area? I didn't measure it. However, I think if there is a small incursion there, we certainly can adhere to Chapter 325 and provide for a 2-to-1 mitigation and replanting. We have 32,000 square feet of uplands and buffers here. It's certainly, we can take some of that area, and it looks to me like a small area. I don't know the square footage, I don't know if Marty had come up with a number or not. But we did have the driveway staked out as per Marty's request. And that did make it very helpful to me, I'm sure to him too, to see exactly where that edge would be. And we certainly would be more than willing to adhere to 2-to-1 mitigation, again, with Marty's approval of how it's done and where it's done. But we have 32,000 square feet. The lot is 72,000 square feet, if I have my number right. So, you know, we have a significant amount of upland area, even though it's buffer for the most part. It certainly can be converted to wetlands without too much trouble.
Thank you.
I'll just kind of summarize a little bit. I know obviously we'll hear from the public, but, you know, I think the applicant is doing the best that they can. I mean, I'd say almost 90% of the property will remain as it is. This is the lightest footprint that would be placed on this property. I think it does meet the standards that this board requires. We are doing everything practical, and I think going to great lengths to make this impact the lightest impact that can occur, with the understanding that it is a buildable lot. So there has to be something, and I think what we've done here is gone through quite a bit of exercise, and obviously working with staff. Again, the staking of the driveway, I think gives, if you've seen it, you'll understand the property. And, you know, our position is we've met the standards and requirements that this board looks to balance the development versus the impact to the environment. And I think we're doing, again, the lightest footprint possible. At least that's our position. Thank you.
Thank you. Marty.
Good evening, Marty Shea, Chief Environmental Analyst for the town. As indicated, there is a preliminary advisory report on record dated March 22nd, 2023. The report expresses that we have, notwithstanding the environmental sensitivity of the site, that we have no significant objections to the residential development plan with respect to the size and location and elevation of the dwelling, with regards to the IA/OWTS installation and the grade modifications that would be necessary in order to install the sanitary system, where the home would be built, recognizing the need to route the driveway in as close to the property boundary as possible. The buffers within the immediate vicinity of the elevated home are being maximized. The applicant has indicated that they're amenable to come forward with a native landscape plan as well, which is certainly beneficial in terms of providing additional habitat for native insects, songbirds, and other wildlife. The concerns that are put forth in the advisory report center on the potential adverse impacts of the drive construction. As indicated at my request, the applicant had a surveyor state the parameters of the drive. As was alluded to by the applicant, at the drive access and entry off the cul-de-sac, the elevations drop. And that's where the wetlands come in. Continuing along the driveway route, there's an extension of those lower elevations and swale until they level off closer to the east side of the property. Acknowledging the topography at the site and the occurrence of diverse natural vegetation in those areas, as well as the ephemeral flooding of those areas. I had asked that the applicant evaluate practicable alternatives to the drive construction plan, which in light of the request for approval of significantly less construction buffer setbacks than are required by code, that evaluation of practicable alternatives is a requirement pursuant to section 325 9D. When I recently went back to the site, there was surface flooding within the portion of the wetlands that would be impacted by the drive, as well as in the adjacent uplands within the swale that runs along the south side of the abutting pervious stone drive. If you take a close look at the engineering plans for the drive, you'll actually see that this change in topography is going to necessitate deposition of 530 cubic yards of fill in order to elevate that section of drive, which is a considerable amount of fill. As was described by the applicant, what they are seeking to do is to dig a long trench alongside the abutting pervious stone drive. And that trench, according to their plans and their reports, would go to a depth of approximately 4.5 feet below the existing grade, as well as 1 feet below groundwater, based upon the test hole data that was provided. And because the water levels in Sagaponic Pond fluctuate considerably, as was recently observed at the site, you can have the water levels, the surface and groundwater levels can indeed be considerably higher than represented by the test hole data that was provided. Access through wetlands and environmentally sensitive areas is, in rare cases, an issue that not only has to be addressed by residential property owners who seek to build, but oftentimes by utility companies. The methodology that is typically used in that case is rather than go with conventional trenching, as was alluded to by the applicant, directional drilling is typically used. And the way that directional drilling is done, and the way it would be applied in this case, is at the cul-de-sac. You would dig a small entry pit using mechanical equipment. The piping then would be directionally put forward underground and within the groundwater table as well, until it reaches an exit pit. This is a property where the use of directional drilling is particularly applicable, probably for about maybe the first 50 to 75 feet for the drive, because that's where the drop-off is, that's where the periodic flooding is, that's where considerable amounts of wetland and adjacent area natural vegetation would have to be removed in order to dig a conventional trench. The trench is being dug for several purposes. One, as just touched on, is for the purposes of running utilities to the elevated residence, but it's also for the purposes of establishing a sufficient subbase with the needed weight-bearing capacity to support vehicles as large as a fire truck that are driven on the driveway. So they're not just going to work with the existing topography. What they're going to do is they're going to excavate, and on top of that excavated trench, they're going to deposit a considerable amount of subbase in order to build that area up so that the elevation of the drive can approximate the abutting stone drive to an abutting residence. In the event that trenching for the purposes of utility installation is done when the water levels are high in Sagaponack Pond, there will likely be a need for dewatering. There will be a need to somehow support the sides of the trench. As you can see, based upon the drawings, the sides of the trench would be somewhat steep. In order to secure that area and stabilize that area, if you are going to construct the drive on subbase and fill, you would have to put in temporary sheeting or something in order to support the walls of the trench. All of that work is going to result in considerable disturbance, clearing of significant amounts of valued natural vegetation, is going to almost certainly result in sedimentation. It's going to result in loss of wetlands, sedimentation, and siltation of adjacent wetlands, which can have particularly adverse impacts when that water level in Sagaponack Pond is high. For those reasons, I had recommended that be evaluated as an alternative, elevating the initial portion of the drive, just to get over that lower ground, and then to directionally drill the utilities for that first section until you get to the level ground. If you look at the survey, you'll see that the driveway begins as a straight shoot east from the cul-de-sac of Seascape Lane, and then it has to make a perpendicular to the south, and then a second perpendicular to the east. Prior to that first needed roughly perpendicular configuration of the drive, you have level ground in that area. So I have no concern with regards to building of that drive on that level ground as it continues its route to the residence. But as indicated, I am greatly concerned about the construction of the initial part of that survey. This is not the first application where we have recommended elevated drive crossings. In fact, there was a recent application that came before this board for a vacant lot in Flanders, where the board had required a partial drive bridge crossing in order to lessen or eliminate impacts to the on-site fresh water wetlands. So in order to adhere to the wetland permit issuance standards as set forth in Chapter 325, I think the applicant still needs to further evaluate those alternatives, and those would be a partial elevated drive crossing within the most sensitive area of the property where the elevations are low and you have intersecting wetlands, and then directional drilling of utilities. Very commonplace today for utilities to be directionally drilled where they need to go through wetlands or within sensitive naturally vegetated areas proximate to wetlands or within areas vulnerable to flooding. It's done very successfully. It's done all the time. So the remainder one, again, it's only the initial part that needs to be directionally drilled. Once the drive makes a perpendicular to the south, the utilities can be conventionally trenched at that time. So this is an application where additional information is needed yet by this board in order to ensure that the potential for adverse wetland impacts at this site is minimized to the maximum extent practicable as directed by code. Thank you.
Moni, I just have a couple of questions. Do we have an idea of approximately the square footage of wetlands that would be disturbed?
I don't have that figure for you, but it's not only the small area of wetlands that would be impacted, it's the adjacent natural vegetation as well. Remember, although these requirements can be met, the code indicates that in order to avoid adverse impacts to wetlands on vacant lots such as this, there should be no disturbance, not only within the wetlands, but within 100 feet landward. Of course, that can't be met here.
They're going to dig a trench for the utilities, and then on top of that trench, they're going to place a driveway?
Yeah, what they're going to do is, yes, they're going to dig a trench.
And I'm confused as to how they can put the driveway in without disturbing the wetlands, or without disturbing the wetlands that would be disturbed by the trench.
Well, the wetlands will be disturbed by
So the wetland's going to be
conventional
disturbed
trench.
whether or not the trench is dug or whether it's done in other ways.
If it's directionally drilled, it would, the routing of the utilities would have very minimal impact on the natural vegetation and
But you're
the
still going to have to
hydrology.
you're still going to have to put a driveway there, correct?
Yeah, you are, and there is no other access that can be utilized in order to reach the area where the residents would be built. So we're not asking, of course, that you not entertain construction of a drive in that area. I'm just asking that in the interest of lessening impacts, that the initial portion of the drive be elevated. What we actually required in the application in Flanders was not only that.
In this particular application, if they were to dig the trench and put in the driveway, could they mitigate it by replanting wetlands?
There's really little opportunity to do that. Understand that they're not only trenching to install the utilities, they're then removing unsuitable soils and replacing those soils with deposited, with I think the number is 530 cubic yards of imported materials or soils used from other portions of the property in order to raise that drive up, so the drive would essentially be at the same level of the abutting stone residential drive. So there's a considerable amount of fill that would be placed in order to create an elevated drive. There's little opportunity to have the drive immediately descend down to the level of the wetlands and the lower elevations of the adjacent area. So I understand why they're looking to elevate that initial section of drive, but I again recommend that that be done structurally rather than through deposition of fill. In the case of the application that came before this board in Flanders, this board also required that elevated drive crossing have a light penetrable surface, and that allows for continued growth of natural vegetation under that elevated drive section.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Again, Charles Bowman, Land Use Ecological Services. I'm certainly, as always, willing to work with Marty on this. I understand that low section there. I guess what I believe he's saying is that the first entrance off of Seascape, going all the way to when the driver would have to take the perpendicular turn to the right, is where the grades that he's objecting to would be impacting those wetlands that are close by, or the grade down. I believe it's that whole distance. But what I might suggest, because I know there's a grade difference there, and if we're trying to reduce that grade difference, perhaps we can, from the first part of Seascape, and I'm picking a length, 50 feet of a low retaining wall, or a low rock retaining wall, so that you're reducing that slope down into the wetlands. I think you can keep the driveway and reduce or eliminate that problem that we're referring to here. And it really would be just a design to be able to do that. Once you get down to going to the perpendicular going south, I don't think there's any problem, which we've all stated, with being able to have any trench or impacts to the wetlands or anything else. So it's really this small area by Seascape that we're talking about. And certainly there's many cases where a low retaining wall is put in to keep from having to have a slope down towards the wetland area. Yeah. And if that little retaining wall impacted a small amount of wetlands, again, I'll reemphasize that we certainly would be more than willing to provide for some mitigation if acceptable. But I think that would eliminate most of the concern here about the slopes.
But just clarify, Marty spoke about the impacts with a high tide from Sag Pond, but I thought you testified you would dig it when it's low tide.
We did, and if the board will recall, the same question came up last time. The trustees have a gauge on the Sag Bridge. It's an orange mark on the bridge there. And when that orange mark, when the pond rises up to that, that's when they open it. So they keep a regular schedule, of course, depending on the year and the amount of precipitation and storms and all those good things. But that's, it's unofficial, paint mark, go open the cut. And so, it would have to be timed at the time when the cut is open, which I think would be part of a permit, Also, last time, we looked at the test hole versus the elevation of that mark when it was taken. And really, there was only about a foot difference at that time, and I'd have to go back through all the records. The trustees don't have an actual elevation; they have a paint mark. So We did, when we were having the survey done, we did have the surveyor give us an elevation of the board that the paint mark is on, so we do have that information. And certainly we can coordinate with the trustees to make sure it's done when the pond is let.
Thank you.
Marty Shea, Chief Environmental Analyst for the town. Recognize that the adverse wetland impacts that would result due to construction of a drive on elevated fill, or they're not only related to the after effects and long-term impacts in terms of any erosion of the newly elevated mounded drive and siltation of the adjacent wetlands. They also are a consequence of the change in the elevations by the deposition of fill, destruction of the vegetation within that filled area, and the trenching may have some impact on the existing hydrology as well. I don't know when the test hole data was taken relative to the opening of Sag Inlet, but I can say that after the applicant had a surveyor stake the drive route and I inspected the property, I did see shallow surface flooding in the area of wetlands to be impacted and the immediate adjacent area. Now, if you were to construct a partially elevated drive, and you would not have to go for the full length to that first perpendicular, you would probably only have to go a half of that distance or maybe even less, because that's where the lower elevations are. And of course, you would have to cut back the shrub thickets as part of the construction of the elevated drive, but you might even have to remove some shrubs, but you then could follow up that elevated drive construction with supplemental planting if needed, with native wetland plants such as soft grasses and other grasses, so that once the elevated section of drive is constructed, much of the vegetation that will flourish under that drive will be lowering ground covering vegetation as opposed to higher shrub thickets. These were some of the issues that we had to address with similar application in Flanders. So I'm just, as directed by code, I'm just trying to be creative here and look at all possible options in terms of minimizing impacts, recognizing that they have no other option but to bring that driveway in, partially in wetlands and immediately alongside wetlands, in order to build a single-family home, which they certainly have a right by zoning to build. Thank you.
Good question, Marty. I think what I'm hearing you say is that you're recommending a bridge that extends from Seascape Lane to some distance, approximately halfway to the first right-hand sharp turn. Is that what you?
No, actually, for a shorter length. What happens is, right at Seascape Lane, the land drops off, and then if you follow the drive route, you have a continuation of a swale, but then it ascends and levels off, so that about halfway to that first perpendicular in the drive, you're reaching level ground. So certainly, when you reach level ground, the drive can just be built on the existing terrain. So in order to address the difficult topography there and the presence of wetlands and close proximity of wetlands, the elevated bridge crossing for the drive would only extend for maybe about half of that first length before you get to that perpendicular that runs south.
Those are the words I used, then you said it'd be much less than that. Now you're saying it would be half.
Oh, and then I misunderstood what you were saying.
So then you're
Chair.
suggesting a bridge that goes about 75 feet, because the whole run looks like 149 feet, and then under that bridge would be directional drilling.
Yes.
But if we approved an elevated driveway, there would be no point in the directional drilling, right?
Oh, yeah, well, that, another option that I think was used in the case of the Flanders application is utilities could potentially be attached to that elevated bridge portion, but probably in this case it would be preferable to directionally drill those utilities. I think it would be a little bit more cumbersome to attach part of those utilities and then to descend underground. So I would still say that directional drilling within that area where you have the difficult terrain and ephemeral flooding and
Yeah.
wetlands is the best option to go with.
That's actually not where I was going. Where I was going was, I'm trying to coordinate to put all this together, because there's a lot of words here, taking a lot of time. But the gist of it is, I believe what I'm hearing you say is, the bridge coordinated with directional drilling is what you're recommending, but if we were to approve an elevated drive, there would be no benefit in directional drilling, because the excavation would have to occur to get a solid base to drive on, especially for heavy vehicles. And it's when that heavy base is excavated and replaced with something that's more porous and can handle the weight that the utilities can be installed.
Well, what you're doing is the way that a drive is built is you're driving essentially pilings in. And the driving in, while initially you have to cut back some of the thickets, the driving in of the pilings or supports for the bridge lessens the amount of impact in terms of that existing terrain and vegetation. So if you go with an elevated crossing, you don't have to destroy, you don't have to significantly modify that terrain below or clear the entire width of the natural vegetation within that section.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Chuck, do you want to respond with anything?
How about the public?
Well, we'll do that in a bit.
Yeah. We're gonna keep going back and forth.
Sure. Charles Bowman, Land Use Ecological Services. Again, I'll go back to my suggestion. I understand what the problem Marty's trying to solve. I don't see why in that particular area to meet the grades, when we first come off of Seascape, which we recognize there is a grade change, why we just can't come back with a small, low retaining wall that's put on right on the edge of the drivable roadway, so we don't have a slope. Yes, we would still have an elevated driveway. We could still trench the utilities in that elevated driveway, and we would be protecting the wetlands from any sedimentation that way. Most times, the permit would be written so that retaining wall has to go in first, before the rest of the work is done, so that you have a stopgap to the excavation in the driveway. We all need a driveway. And then if there is any mitigation that is needed for that retaining wall in that little area, it looks to me like the wetland comes just closest, maybe 20 feet from Seascape. So that's the area that's most important that would be impacted, and we certainly could put a small retaining wall in there. It could even be driven, so it doesn't even have to be excavated, and then build the driveway, which I think would solve everybody's problem here.
If you're willing to do something like that, I actually have no problem with that. I think the excavation for a driveway or the change in grade for a driveway, I think it needs to be done anyway, and I don't see for such a short period of time where we need to have a bridge. I don't think that's necessary at all.
Well,
But if you're willing to do something like that, just whatever you can do to mitigate it, I'd rather just do it that way.
I think we could do it that way. Again, we do it all the time, and we do it on tidal wetlands all the time, where we drive a wall in to avoid the wetlands that are on the bay side, and then do the work on the landward side. I think it's not going to be for that long a time, and we certainly can meet with Marty as part of the permit approval process that says, okay, it should be 15 feet long, 20 feet long, whatever we decide to be able to meet the grade.
Yeah, but I don't think a bridge is necessary for such a short distance.
Open to other ideas from other feelings from the rest of the board, if you want to go with more information, or if you like the retaining wall idea. We need to make a decision on this pretty soon.
I'm fine with the retaining wall. Agreed, I do like the retaining wall as well.
Okay.
Mhm.
Is there someone in the public who would like to speak in this application? Yes, sir.
Good evening, board members. I'm Jeff Bragman. I represent Dan Barry, who's a neighbor to the south, whom you may remember from the last application that we went through. It seems to me that we're doing a lot of talking about structures with very little engineering detail on what we're talking about. And I think it's significant because with respect, neither Mr. Bowman nor the representative from Mr. Grosser's firm are structural engineers. We've never seen a road profile. I think the board would be well served to get a driveway profile so we can actually see in a section what we're talking about here before you make a decision as to where to go. I also noticed, I may have missed it in the file, but I looked through the file yesterday, and I don't see any updated survey from the applicant that has the latest plan on it. He's kind of piecing it together from, he's got a dewatering plan, he's got a septic plan, but I think it's a requirement of an application to put it all on a survey. And as far as I could see, I may have missed it, but it ain't there. So I
We
think,
usually require a survey before the permit is released.
I'm sorry?
We don't always require a survey at this stage of the application, but we require it before the application the permit is released.
Well, I think the board would be well served if they could see on a survey where, for example, the dry wells are placed. You don't even have a survey that shows that.
We don't need a survey to show that.
Well, I would suggest you do. The application has changed.
Okay, your point is taken.
Thank you. In addition, so I think, if I understood what Marty Shea was saying, he was saying that there's an area here, we acknowledge that everybody that has a house has to have a driveway, but I think what he's saying is that there's an area where he's suggesting and recommending no disturbance because of the terrain, the change in terrain, and that's why he's talking about an elevated a bridge on that first section. And it seems like a reasonable alternative that you should be examining, and to do so, you need some engineering. And while Mr. Bowman may be happy to give you another retaining wall, it sort of exacerbates the problem that Marty's talking about in the first place, because what he's trying to do is he's trying to avoid trenching and excavation in that first part of the driveway. So the solution that Mr. Bowman is offering really is not a solution. It's worsening the problem that your environmental analyst is pointing out. We haven't discussed the propane tank and what's going to happen with it. We haven't discussed the pool and where it's going to be decanted and whether this house should have a pool. By the way, we keep referring to the house as a 1,000 square foot house. It's not a 1,000 square foot house. It's a 1,000 square foot footprint. So it's a 2,000 square foot house. Admittedly, a reduction from the last application, I'm aware of that. But it's a 2,000 square foot house with a pool, with dry wells that are necessary to decant that pool. And the excavation that Marty's talking about is very significant. They're talking about 530 cubic yards to stabilize that driveway and make it secure. If a dump truck has about 20 cubic yards, that's what, 100 and, you'll have to do the math on that as to how many dump trucks it would take. It's quite a bit of, I see you, the chairman, looking to see, is a dump truck 20 cubic yards? I think that's what we looked up when we checked it. So the issue that Marty's addressing is pretty serious. It's 530 cubic yards. And the sensitivity of this land, I think, is apparent. Some of the discussion that you've had now about the test hole is a little disturbing because it's been sort of glossed over that, I think Mr. Bowman said, well, there might be a 1 foot difference. If I read the documents correctly, the depth to groundwater on this property is 2.5 feet. So a 1 foot difference, if that test hole was drilled at a time when the cut was open and the water was at the lowest level, it doesn't bode well for minimal impact construction, which I think is, I think it lends weight to what Marty Shea is telling you should be avoided in that first section of the property. None of you actually have had much of a chance to look at this information, which just came in recently. And I would request that we take an adjournment on this. I have, as you may recall, I have a team that I've worked with on this application, but the time in which we've had to look over these materials has been pretty short. And I think the application is incomplete. I think we need a survey, we need a driveway profile. I think if you're going to debate and consider and accept or reject a bridge, I think we should see what it's about. We don't have an engineer in the room to do that, to give us the real information. So I would...
Another point is that it is a rooftop pool too, which is a little bit different dynamic than one that was covering. Right?
Not really on this property, because a rooftop pool, no matter what kind of a filtration system it uses, whether it's saltwater, freshwater, whatever it's using, it's going to need chlorine. They all need chlorine at some point, and it's going to have, it's less chlorine, but it's going to have to be.
We're talking about the distance from wetlands. It's not increasing the distance from wetlands, decreasing distance from wetlands because it's outside of the footprint of the dwelling.
It's
within
putting
the footprint of the dwelling. So we're talking about the distance to wetlands. And that's what a lot of 325 is really geared towards, is distance from wetlands in addition to everything else we talk about.
That's my point. When this pool is going to be decanted and cleaned, because it's going to have to be cleaned, that water is going to be injected into a dry well. Those dry wells are closer to the wetlands because they're on the southern side of the house. If we had a survey, we could show you on the survey where they
Site
are.
plan has dry wells on the one page of the site plan.
I
that we have
I saw it, but it
And
should be.
the formal survey will be submitted before we release
Well,
a permit.
you'll
It has to
no-
match everything that the permitting
Is there-
requires.
I'm glad to hear that, but you'll note that the dry wells are on the southern side of the house. There's like 4 or 5, 6 of them. I forget the exact number. So that's where that's going. And when you put a dry well into land near a wetland, you're injecting that water into the groundwater faster. That's what you're doing. And I'm saying that when you look at this house, it's not a benign amenity. A swimming pool on the top of this house on a piece of land like this. It's been a long time since we talked about the quality of the environment here. And I think that alone is worth at least one more discussion in front of this board when we can revisit that and see if you've still got an endangered bird that appears to be hunting there, which the last time I was here, I reminded the board that you have the responsibility and the authority to notify the DEC of a potential taking of that endangered bird. So there, and the quality of this wetland is notable. Last time around, we told you, and Marty confirmed in his memo, that there is property beyond the boundaries, the boundaries designated as the limit of wetlands. There are wetlands beyond that area, because this land regularly produces ephemeral ponds and flooding. Again, related to the depth to groundwater, which is extremely shallow, 2.5 feet. There's also excavation, I think, for the dewatering plan. It's a 3-day plan, I think, to remove 100,000 gallons of water in order to do the construction work. This is not a simple plan, and I think it merits a little more attention than a single night's hearing, frankly. And I'd like to have an opportunity to come back with my engineers and the consultants that we use. I'd like to see what Marty's bridge idea would take, what the engineering is on it. I don't think it's enough for an applicant to just tell a board, well, it's kind of expensive. It's expensive, and we don't want to do it, and we'll build a retaining wall. And I've already said why I think a retaining wall is not it's not an answer. In fact, it's more of the same problem. That's all I have tonight. I would request that you continue it and withhold deciding for at least one more time to get some more information on this.
Thank you. Kevin, is there anybody online? On Zoom?
No, not on Zoom.
Okay. Is there anyone else in the public who'd like to speak on this application?
With new information?
Did you want to respond, or did,
Yeah, really quick, I know we've been going.
do you have new information?
Yeah, just,
New information?
yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, really quickly, I do believe that there is a road profile in the plans that is noted as C102. So there is a road profile in there for the board to take a look at. That was one of the points. The other issue was, if we misspoke, the board wanted a 1,000 square foot, which is the footprint, which we all know. That is what we are proposing. The second story is really not pertinent to this discussion. I just want to add that to the board. We also have a dry well that is going to be dewatering the pool. The calculations that Mr. Brady said were incorrect. I think the number is 18,000 for dewatering, not 100,000. Just to clear the record up, I'm sure the board is well aware of that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Marty Shea, Chief Environmental Analyst for the town. Because this was touched upon, the 530 cubic yards of fill that need to be placed for driveway construction, that equates to about 28 dump trucks. So we're talking about a lot of fill. And with regards to retaining wall construction, the further impacts related to that are not just associated with the wall, it's associated with the footings, associated with potentially needed removal of additional unsuitable soils in order to ensure that that retaining wall is stable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just one more point. The 537 cubic yards is the total. We're planning on using some of the soils from on-site, so the actual importation of fill would only be 100 and some odd, depending on if the soil's usable or not. But I just want to make sure that you understood that. It's not 28.
I'm sorry, did you say you'd probably have to bring in 100?
Yeah, it's probably anywhere between 100 and 200 yards that may have to be brought in.
And the rest you're gonna have
Or
on
reuse
site?
on site. We have to
Okay.
excavate for the sanitary and dry wells and all that good stuff. And it's all on the plan. There's a list of the cut and fills right on the plan.
Mr. Chairman, can I make one more comment? Jeff Ragman for Dan Berry. I don't pretend to be an engineer, but I see a a driveway cross-section of a piece of the driveway, but when I was referring to it, a driveway profile, the driveway profiles that I've seen on applications take the entire length of the driveway in cross-section and show you the natural topography and where the driveway deviates from the natural topography and where it follows the natural topography. It's a very illuminating engineering piece of information that would help this board really understand what's going on with the driveway. This cross-section is not a driveway profile on C-102.
Thank you.
Make a motion to close the public hearing.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
Make a motion to close the public hearing, so no information for me.
A second?
Are we going to allow this other information to be submitted?
About a bridge?
Yeah. What
Uh,
Mr.
if-
Bowman brought up?
If you're interested in pursuing a bridge at this location, then we would need more information. If the retaining wall is sufficient, then, and we've heard enough information, then we can close the public hearing and make a decision.
Okay.
So it really depends on, if you want more information, if you want to explore that bridge idea more, then we should leave it open so that we can get more information. But if you're content with, if you don't want a bridge here and content with what he's offered to do, then we can close.
It sounded like everyone was okay with the alternative to a bridge.
Yeah, I
And if everyone's gonna,
just wanted to give everybody an opportunity to submit any information. It's not saying that I am not comfortable, with the retaining wall, but I like giving people the opportunity to bring something in.
What we
that
can
might-
do is
Leave it
close the
with
hearing
them.
with a written comment period.
written
Okay,
comment period.
How long? 10 days?
10
2
days.
weeks?
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
2
Okay.
weeks. So
And
we
then-
should set the closing time at 4 o'clock Wednesday, 2 weeks from today.
Okay.
I amend my motion to accommodate that comment.
It's been moved and
Second.
seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Thank you.
So is Zeb still out there or did he go home? Sure. A 022069 Grace S. Sutton. And this has been heard, we don't need that, of course, seen the affidavit. So, Rich, you may present your application.
Good evening, Richard Warren from InterScience Research Associates. I'm here with John Bennett, who's the attorney for Grace Sutton, who is here back there with her husband Edmund. Tom Strauss is also here. However, his wife Wendy Cronwell could not be here tonight. She had another conflict in scheduling. Tom and Wendy are in contract to purchase the property. I'm also here with Shannon Corcoran from my office, Lori Beppo of Blaze McCoy, who designed the home on this property, and Paul DeLandro, who did the engineering for the septic and drainage. At the last meeting that we were here, we were asked to make some revisions to the plan for this project. A package of materials was submitted that included all of those revisions. I just thought I'd go over those with you. To increase the wetland setback, we were asked to shift the residence as far west as we could reasonably move it. This is a copy of the proposed revegetation plan. The house was moved in this direction, and it was moved over to a minimum setback off of the western property line that's allowed under 330-83K. The house wetland setback, which you were asking for an increase from this location here, went from 5 feet to 9.4 feet. The deck setback from 2.7 to 6.5. The house is located at the minimum setback from the street through here because we need room to place the sanitary system, and these are all the minimum requirements. We can't move the house any further to the south. This plan will require some relief from the Zoning Board of Appeals for a front yard setback as well as pyramid for some railings on the roof deck. With the house shift moving over, the pervious gravel driveway was reconfigured and it was reduced in area by 97 square feet. It nominally increased the setback by another foot. The garage door and the entry door in this area were flipped, so this way we could pull this down a little bit further to the south. The position of propane tank was moved. It was on the side here. We moved it adjacent to the driveway, and that will be screened with vegetation, native vegetation. The limited disturbance was reduced. This is a really tight plan, as you've seen with the last submissions, but we reduced the clearing on this property from 4998 square feet to 4872 square feet. So we got another 126 square feet of undisturbed area in the property. Our plans show a perimeter project limiting fence that would be installed to control the construction activity. The stormwater drainage plan has been revised. We had originally proposed, as you may recall, some drainage out underneath the decking and underneath a portion of the house through here. That is now all contained underneath the driveway. And by doing that, we were able to reduce some of the fill on the site as well. We have 2 inches storage capacity for the drainage that's shown. The fill that had previously been proposed under the house in order to accommodate the drainage had been eliminated. The sanitary system was adjusted to reflect the highest anticipated groundwater on the property. The grade over top of the septic system is approximately 1 foot over the existing grade. We're using a pressurized drain field, so we don't have to do retaining walls. If you'll remember, the house to the east and the house to the west did not use pressurized drain fields. They have concrete retaining walls that hold their septic systems. But this is a pressurized drain field which does not require as much fill and keeps it down as low as possible. So we're able to do with a geomat pressurized system so that the fill required for the septic system is only about 1 foot over existing grade. We provided revised cut and fill calculations. We have 32 yards of cut on the property, 54 yards of fill, so there's actually a net increase of 22 yards on this property. So we've actually tried to keep this really tight. The first and second floor decking are using light penetrating materials to allow for the growth of vegetation underneath. The first floor deck that's over here, it wraps around the home. We've got just a narrow 3-foot deck behind, so you can actually walk out the house and walk down to the side where this is only 10 feet wide. Just really wide enough for a dining room table for someone to sit out there and have a barbecue and a dinner outside. But it'll be light penetrating, but that deck is 11 feet above grade. So it's not close to grade. So there's actually the ability for vegetation to grow underneath. We've submitted a revised revegetation plan here that reflects all of the changes. That includes the vegetation that was previously asked by the Environment Division. And we also have a note on here that any disturbed area on the roadside would be revegetated. Just as a reminder, because I know not all of you were here at the last presentation, there's just a couple of, I think, important facts relative to this property. The Suttons have owned this property since 1946. They've owned this prior to zoning. They've owned this since prior to wetlands. Grace Sutton, who's here, she inherited this property in 1986, which is, again, prior to the wetlands regulations adopted by the town. Over those 77 years of ownership, they have been assessed by the town for this as a buildable lot. It's currently assessed at $4.12 million. They pay $17,000 a year in taxes as a buildable lot. The assessment numbers that they have for the property right now are equivalent to some of the improved properties in this area. So here they've owned this prior to zoning. I think they have some hardship relative to the adoption of the regulations relative to that. In 2001, Sutton's actually offered this property to the town for sale. Through the Community Preservation Fund. The town chose not to purchase it. So in terms of looking at practical alternatives, we looked at the no development alternative. They did back in 2001, but the town chose not to buy it because it's not near any other preserved properties. Recognizing the constraints of the property, the project team that they've put together really worked hard. This is a small house. The gross floor area of this house is 1,573 square feet on 2 floors. It has a footprint of around 800 square feet, so it's small. The usable functional area of this house, when you subtract out the stairway, it's right here to get from one floor to the other, the usable functional space is 1,394 square feet. It's pretty small. The minimum house size under zoning is 1,400 square feet. So we've tried to keep the pencil pretty sharp. This house is smaller than the house that was recently approved to the east. The house on this site originally was 620 square feet. It was approved by this board to go to 2,200 square feet gross floor area. The house to the west that you recently approved is 2,000 square feet. This house is narrow in depth. It's only 15 feet 8 inches deep. So you could fit this house and the deck in the width of this room. It's a pretty narrow house. It's one room wide. The house is in an AE 14 flood zone, but it's seaward of Limwa, so it requires it to be elevated. First floor of this house will be 18 foot in elevation. So that's why the decks will be up so high. The space below the residence will be utilized for a garage and 2 small closets for storage, which are both allowed by FEMA. There will be breakaway standards because that's what's required. The decks that are proposed are small, 362 and 390 square feet, one on each floor. And if you see the architectural plans, you'll see that they match. There's no extension beyond. They're identical. There's just an indent on part of the house in one corner right through here. So that's why they're different in size. It's 3 feet wide, again on the north side, and about 10 feet deep on the western side. This is an area that gives them some place to have some outdoor activity. There's no place on this property to do anything, no place to barbecue, no place to spend any time outside. If you minimize the size of the decking to the first and second floor, to minimize it, they also put a roof deck. There's a small roof deck up here, and the remainder of the roof is planned to be for either solar or green roof in order to meet the HERS requirements and the owner's objectives. The total coverage of the house and the deck, here is 1,163 square feet. The house to the east, the total coverage on that property is 1,890 square feet. So this is dramatically smaller than this. And the house to the west has 1,290 square feet, so we're smaller than that one as well. So we've actually really tried to keep our pencil pretty sharp as we designed this. The outdoor space is important to the owner. You know, it's for outdoor leisure space, for barbecuing, for outdoor dining, for chairs to sit outside, to do some container gardening with some plants. We submitted, as part of our recent submission to the board, some documentation from the Southampton Town trustees that they use in a submission to the Army Corps of Engineers. It's a fairly thick document, this one, that shows and demonstrates through photographs as well as sites that you can grow vegetation on underneath decks where those decks are 3 feet above grade. So we're at least 11 feet above grade. So there's plenty of room for light and air, and since these are through-flow decking, there'll be ability for water to get underneath. We minimized the fill, again, with a net import of 22 yards. On the eastern property, over here, 422 yards were approved, 295 yards were approved. We have a net increase of 22. A considerable portion of this property will be left undisturbed. We'll expect, as part of the condition of approval, there'll be some covenants and restrictions that'll put a buffer over this by the time we get done. So we've worked really hard on this from the beginning because we recognize this is a difficult site. But we've worked really hard to try to come in with a really compact home and compact development on this site. I'm here with the rest of the project team if you have any questions relative to what we presented. But I think we've addressed the requests that you made of us.
Thank you, Rich.
Good evening, Teresa Mason from the Environment Division. At our previous public hearing, we had recommended that the Conservation Board, the applicant, also look at reducing the footprint of the house. Specifically, this section here, which sticks out, is slightly smaller than the remaining portion of the residence. We recommended that that portion be eliminated, thereby creating what would be 640 square feet of footprint, which is consistent with the guidance we had provided to the contract vendee prior to making the application. I went through the exercise of redesigning, redesigning the project plan based on our recommendations, and I was able to come up with a project plan where a 640 square footprint house was constructed 11.4 feet from wetlands, and they were able to have 106 square feet of decking over the proposed driveway. and you were able to achieve a greater setback, more consistent with the parcel to the east, which was pre-existing developed, so that has to be the lesser setback. Here, you can also have this one. Okay? And I'll give these to Karina to stamp in. So, for us, the main consideration here is the size of the dwelling and the fact that it's 9 feet from the wetlands as currently proposed. As recommended previously, we had requested that the size be reduced to 600 square feet, or between 600 and 700 square feet, which is still more than the minimum allowed by the town code. Additionally, I would like to dispute Mr. Warren's, dispute Mr. Warren with respect to the depth of the dwelling. This section, which we are recommending be removed and eliminated, is 15 feet. This section is 20 feet, which is the minimum allowed by the town code. So it's not like we're asking for them to be reduced beyond what the town code allows as the minimum. So what this would result in is almost a 1,300 square foot home on pilings, and it would be 11 feet from wetlands. Again, Mr. Warren keeps pointing out the property to the east. It started off as a 600 square foot house, 5 feet from the wetlands. They were allowed to demolish and expand the home in a more conforming location, 12 feet from the wetlands, which is still more than the proposed plan that I've passed out to you. It's 11.4 as my proposed plan. So, it is an increase. It's a small increase, but when you take the cumulative impacts of the increased coverage on the lot, the increased disturbance on the lot, the setbacks, it all adds up. And it's not just just the overall, how close we are to the wetlands. It's everything. Like I said, I did redesign the plan, or did come up with a recommended plan. It allows for 120 square feet of decking over the proposed driveway on each of the floors, and that achieves setback as just shown on the chart that I gave you. I believe it's 13 feet to 15 feet. And let's see. So, based on my recommendations, we can achieve a coverage calculation of 760 square feet versus the applicant's proposal, which is almost 500 square feet more at 1,160 square feet. So that's almost double what we're recommending. Aside from the minor changes to the footprint of the dwelling and the shifting of the structures in accordance with the plan that I am recommending, there just needs to be some minor cleanup on the survey. But we don't really necessarily have a problem with the septic system location and the fill that's needed for the septic system. The driveway configuration can be, tightened up and shifted as needed as part of the redevelopment plan. Another thing I would like to point out, Mr. Warren said that the adjacent lots had a lot more fill deposition, but as a reminder, those septic systems were approved using conventional leaching galleys or leaching rings, which were approved before the changes that allowed for the shallow distribution trenches. Those were done in 2012 and 2014. The code for the health department changed in 2017. So that's why more fill was required. That's why retaining walls were required. At that time, that was what was allowed. So again, we don't have a problem with the septic system. It is what it is where it is, and it's the minimum that can be done. It's just the footprint of the dwelling, the location and configuration of the decks that we are recommending be reduced. Any questions?
Thank you, Teresa.
John Bennett for the applicant. I know in the past you've balked at hearing this and saying every site is specific, but that's to a certain case true, but the law requires that you look at activities that you have
permitted in the past on adjacent lots. And we did, Rich talked about some of this, but we did very handily put this information into the record. This is a gross area, 1,573 square feet is proposed, but when you take out the stairways and the mechanical space, it's a 1,398 square foot house. Your experts are simply wrong. 1,400 square feet is the minimum house size in the R60 zone. That's in the code. The code section is 330105. So where this chimera of less than 1,400 square feet is coming from, I don't know. I'll just refer your counsel to that, to the code. But let's talk a little bit about what has been done in the past. The Burnett's did an approval back in, gave them an approval back in August 15, 2004, a 1,400 square foot house. That's on the lot that's just to the north of that, what I call the culvert, and from Channel Pond into the Cubs Bay. Then, very recently, and this is really has me scratching my head, the property to the east, much smaller. Yeah, there was a 6,000 square foot house.
John, would you mind talking closer to the
I'm sorry, there was a 600 square. Thank you. There was a 600 square foot house there. You allowed them a 2,194 square foot house relatively recently. That's 1122 Flying Point Road. Rosenblatt Mow to the west, the adjacent lot to the west, a 2,000 square foot house was approved. And then another house under the control of Rosenblatt Mow, which is to the south of Channel Pond. That's been there for some time. That's 4,750 square feet. But interestingly enough, this board allowed, under the same law, the exact same law, an addition to that house in the mid 90s. So to suggest, first of all, that that this is consistent with the prior applications that were approved by this board is just literally to try to ignore the law. And you have to look at those. Many years ago in East Hampton, I litigated successfully a case. It's called Bond versus Redless. Stanley Redless was the head of the Zoning Board of Appeals at the time, and as you know, these kinds of applications are brought in East Hampton as special natural resources special permits in the town of East Hampton. And the board tried to ignore sites where larger houses had been permitted when they denied my client's application, and the court sent it back with very stern language saying that the board took a see no evil, hear no evil attitude towards the surrounding grants of applications that they had made. It was very critical of the board. So there's no disputing that 1,400 square feet is the smallest house possible. Number one, and we're actually, if you take up the staircase and the mechanicals, underneath that. But there's something else very, very basic that's going on here, and it was something that was recently criticized by a decision of Judge Modilewski against the Supreme Court against the Zoning Board of Appeals of East Hampton in the Dante Brittis versus ZBA case. And here's what the court said in being critical of the Zoning Board of Appeals in East Hampton on a natural resources special permit. Just let me get it up because it's very apt for what's going on here. The board denied an application, a very, very minor application, and all the board talked about was how pristine the area was. And in sending the case, and in reversing the board in that case, and I'll have a copy of this for counsel, reveals a board devoted to chronicling the pristine nature of the surrounding land. This case is 2 weeks old. Reveals a board devoted to chronicling the pristine nature of the surrounding land and water, but utterly failing to particularize how and why this modest proposal would have any deleterious effect on the surrounding land and water. Stated another way, there is no articulation that the grant of the application sought here would allow petitioner to use his land in derogation of the rights of others or the town. So if someone wants to explain to me how a difference of approximately 250 square feet, there's some nexus between that and some deleterious effect on the area, please do that. Put that in the record because I don't see how you can legally do it. We don't have any interest whatsoever in reducing this house. We think we've been worked extremely hard to bring this. I'm really surprised the staff isn't more appreciative of what we've done here. We're trying to make an extremely small footprint on this. We have absolutely no interest whatsoever in reducing the size of this house, but below what is the legal minimum. I think Rich we were talking about there must be some sort of mistake on staff on this 1,400 square foot number. I think they're grasping at straws. Rich and I looked at it. I want Rich to explain it to you.
So when you read section 330-105, which I have on my phone here, and it's minimum maximum floor areas. In the R60 zoning district, one-story building or first floor is 1,000 square feet. For 1.5 or 2-story building, combined two-floor total is 1,400 square feet. Adjacent area to the coastal zone, 400 square feet first floor, 600 square feet total. We're not adjacent to the coastal zone, so when you read the definition of the code, they're talking about the coastal erosion hazard area zone, which is on the southern side of the road. We are on the north side, by definition in your code. So those provisions don't apply.
Just a little bit of legislative history on that. There was an attempt when they defined that adjacent area, because Rich and I were very involved.
John, the microphone.
Thank you. I'm sorry. We were very involved in when there were amendments to the coastal erosion hazard area, and then the zoning code. There was an attempt to make the coastal zone a blanket 500 to 600 to 750. I think Steve Kenny at the time wanted it to be 1,000 feet, and it was settled that it was the south side of the road. We're not in that zone, so you don't even have the beginnings of an argument that the house, you can make us have a house less than 1,400 square feet. So I don't know why this keeps appearing. I don't know why this keeps appearing. But regardless of that nature, given what you've done in this area, we think this falls squarely in the types of applications that you've approved, and it's a very, very sensitive, non-aggressive use of this property. We have no interest whatsoever in reducing the size of the house. So we would just simply, and we think there's more than enough evidence in the record to justify you reasonably and responsibly granting this approval. So we would ask you to close the hearing and make a decision. Oh, please do, after Mr. Warren talks.
I feel a little bit like no good deed goes unpunished.
Yeah.
You know, we tried to make a really small house here. So as part of making that house small, we cut this in here. This is the stairway going up. These are the floor plans developed by the architect. So we cut this in here. By taking off this section, and because it's convenient, because it's just an indent on the property, where maybe we should have put some closets there, so there was not a line to say, let's slice it off. But if you do that, you're taking away the master bedroom, and you're taking away the living room. This is, again, this is a small house for a property owner who's owned this since prior to zoning, who's paid taxes for 77 years. And this is a small house. So we would ask you actually to really consider those facts, because we think that they are salient facts relative to your consideration of what can happen here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rich.
Teresa Mason again from the Environment Division. Just a couple of points. Mr. Bennett pointed out that several other properties in the area had been approved in recent history, and yes, that is the case, but according to the January 6th submission by InterScience, if you look at that chart here, most of these dwellings that were constructed, with the exception of the lot that was to the east, where they had a pre-existing house 5 feet from the wetlands and went to 12.5 feet from the wetlands, most of them have a setback significantly greater than what is currently proposed. The most non-conforming of the structures that were approved is 34 feet from the wetlands. It is a difference. It is a big difference in that particular instance. So, you know, he is making a comparison. It's not an apples to apples comparison, because we got a lot more distance between the developments. We got additional areas of buffer. So it's not easy to say that this is comparable to the other lots and we should get approved. With respect to the footprint, I got that information from the building inspectors. If that is incorrect, was given to me incorrectly from the building inspectors. I confirmed that with them earlier this week. And then secondly, the practical alternatives requirement by the building and zoning code, the wetland code requires us to look at the scale of the project, not just the setbacks, right? So is 800 square feet, almost 1,400 square feet of footprint a lot on a lot where you're having an 11-foot setback? That has to be the practical alternative. Why can't we go down to 600 square feet? Okay, if 600 square feet is not meeting the code, then 700 square feet, and then you meet the setback requirement at 1,400. There are ways to further reduce the project and the scope of the project and the scale of the project to try and get a greater setback, lesser coverage, tighter development. Any other questions?
Thank you.
One thing, what is John Bennett again? What you unequivocally can't run away from is the fact that to the east, there was a 600
absolutely.
square foot house, and you gave them, totally not in conformity, on a smaller parcel, and you gave them an 1,800 square foot addition. So even if there weren't any of the other, what the town says is, staff says apples and oranges, I think they're extremely on point.
No.
But even if there weren't any other of those approvals, you gave a guy with a 600 square foot house an 1,800 square foot addition to the east. But I think the horse has been beaten by both sides now. We would simply ask you to close the matter. We have nothing else to add. We have no interest whatsoever in downsizing this house, and candidly, we think that a denial of this application would be arbitrary, capricious, and contrary to your prior approvals, even if the east house was, the house to the east was the only one. But we thank you for listening. Thank you.
Is there anyone in the public who'd like to speak on this application? Is there anybody on Zoom, Kevin? Who wants to speak?
No one on Zoom.
Okay, let me just wrap things up here because this is winding down, but our agenda has not wound down yet. We got a ways to go yet. Anyway. I'll compliment you on what you've done, Rich, and I guess you've done most of the planning. It is an improvement. It is hard. It's very, very constrained. There's no question. So what we're talking about is the size of the house, essentially, because that's what drives going to 11-foot setback. Well, it's not going to be 11-foot setback. Apparently, the best we can do is 100 feet less than what is being applied for. But we have to make a decision. If we want more information, we cannot approve a 700 square foot house, by the way, because they have not offered that as an alternative. The staff sketch is not an alternative. They have to offer it. But we can keep the public hearing open and require them to come up with some alternatives, or we can close it and make a decision of either approving or denying the approximately 800 square foot house. I just need to hear from you guys what you're thinking, because I don't really know.
I can appreciate what Teresa is trying to do. I can also appreciate what the applicant is trying to do. Part of what's entering into my mind is the size of the lot and the amount of wetlands that are covering this lot, way more than 50%. The other side of the issue to me is the neighborhood. This would be an extremely small dwelling in the neighborhood. I'm always looking to preserve the wetlands. Don't misunderstand where I'm going with this. But I'm looking at the lot and the amount of wetlands that are on the lot and the amount of usable space. And I think we have to bend a little bit here and give them an appreciable home to live in, considering where it is and what else I said about the amount of wetlands on the property. So I'm inclined to go along with what they're asking for. Also, I don't think we have an alternative. We either close it and deny it and then go to court, because John has made it very clear what his intentions are. So sometimes you have to compromise, and I think this is one of those times. That's where I'm coming from. And Teresa, I appreciate what you're trying to do, and you did an extremely good job at your job.
Anyone else want to speak?
I'm ready to close.
I'm ready to close.
Well, I have mixed feelings, I guess like George does. You know, that I would have liked the applicant maybe to consider not going down to Teresa's recommendation, but maybe decreasing the size of the house. I don't like making decisions that somebody's threatening to sue. You know, and you make a decision based on that. That's bullying, as far as I'm concerned. But it is, in this day and age, and especially in that area, a moderately sized house. So I would go to close it. It's not something that I'm comfortable with at all, but I would agree to close the hearing.
Is there a motion to close the hearing?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night, Teresa.
Good night, Teresa.
The next application is W 2201009 48 Whites Lane LLC.
Oh, you need a majority plus one for this?
No,
Oh, not this one.
no, that's the way. Now, just to put things in context, at the last time we met, we had to use 16 acres of forest to make enough paper to cover those things that were presented to us.
Then we presented another 10 acres earlier this week.
Yeah. But I had asked that we adjourn the hearing so that the board could visit the site, and also so the board could read through the information that had been presented. So now, did you want to add anything, or do we
Well,
want to just?
I mean, if we're going to adjourn it, we might as well just adjourn it and,
Well, no, we adjourned it so that we could look
Oh.
at that information, and now is the time that the board needs to have a
I'm sorry, I
discussion.
misunderstood. I thought you...
No, I'm not suggesting we adjourn, I'm not suggesting what we're doing next,
Okay.
in terms of after today. Rather, just want to bring us up to date on where we are in this application. But if you have new information you want to present, you may do that.
Well, the only information that I wanted to present was, you know, again, as I had mentioned earlier this week, in order to we provided further evidence of the lack of wetlands on the subject property. We submitted a report by Nelson, Pope, and Voorhees, who was hired by the applicant in order to assess the absence or presence of wetlands on the subject property. Nelson, Pope, Voorhees is an environmental planning and consulting firm that serves governmental and private sector clients. Among their areas of expertise are ecological assessment, wetlands delineation, and habitat assessment. Nelson Pope and Voorhees conducted field work at the subject property on April 26th and 27th of this year to assess the wetlands conditions pursuant to the definitions and standards set forth in Chapter 325 of the Southampton Town Code. They categorized the existing vegetation on the property, assessed soil and hydrologic conditions on the property relative to the town code and the wetlands delineation standards under Chapter 325, as well as federal and state wetland delineation guidelines. They produced a report which I had mentioned, which was submitted this past Monday, Monday morning, first thing. I just wanted to summarize, I guess, the findings in that report for the board. They basically stated that according to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, freshwater wetland mapping resources, and the National Wetlands Inventory maps, there are no wetland areas on the subject property. These maps do identify freshwater wetlands to the north of the property across White's Lane. However, the subject property does not contain any wetlands pursuant to the definitions and standards outlined in Chapter 325 of the Southampton Town Code, as well as federal and state freshwater wetlands delineation standards and guidelines. And they point to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation letter, or issuance of a letter of no jurisdiction for the subject property that was issued on March 1st of 2022. They being, again, Nelson Pope and Voorhees, reviewed a number of historic and aerial photographs to further support their conclusion that there are no wetlands on site. They reviewed aerial photographs from 1962 through 2016, which showed a significant change to the area immediately surrounding the property through residential development and road and infrastructure improvements, which we spoke about, if the board recalls, during the last public hearing. Again, Nelson Pope and Voorhees stated that these changes likely interrupted the natural flow of water throughout the area, resulting in hydraulic changes in the area and to the subject property, and created a habitat, quote-unquote, suitable for upland vegetation species. On the dates that they were there, again on April 26th and 27th, their ecologists inventoried the existing vegetative conditions on the property. They identified these species and cross-referenced with the National Wetland Plant List, and they determined that the subject property is a successional woodland. Predominant canopy of the site includes red maples, tree of haven, black cherry, black locust, and black gum. Other plant species on site were within the sparse understory, which included Canada mayflower, Pennsylvania sedge, garlic mustard, Japanese barberry, and multiflora rose. They identified 30 different vegetative species on the property, but there were no obligate wetland plants, which are, as the board I'm sure is aware, plants that almost always occur in wetlands. They did find 2 facultative wetland plants. They found 7 facultative plants, 13 facultative upland plants, and 4 upland plants, and 4 of which they listed as unlisted. They indicated that while the canopy is dominated by red maple, the presence of this species alone does not meet the qualification of a wetlands designation, which again is something that we had touched upon during the last public hearing. The understory of the subject property, they determined it was dominated by facultative upland species, which have a low percentage of occurrence in wetland environments. They also looked at the soils and the hydrology on site. They conducted 5 test pits. During their investigation, they found no perched water. Saturated soils were encountered within 24 inches of the ground surface. No moisture was exuded from the soils when squeezed in the palm of their hand. The results of the on-site soil assessment indicated that the predominant soils on the property are Plymouth Loamy Sand PIA and PIC, which according to the 19 Suffolk County Soil Survey are identified also on the surrounding parcels. Plymouth loamy sand PIA and PIC soils are described as having excessively drained soils, typically having sandy and gravelly textures. They are not hydric soils, thus they do not support freshwater wetlands. So this is consistent, that finding is consistent with what they observed on site. And again, it's also consistent with the soil samplings taken by Sean Barron and Drew Associates at the site, which were discussed during our last meeting. They examined, again, Nelson Pope and Voorhees examined wetland maps, noted there are no documented wetlands located on the property based upon regional mapping sources typically used for preliminary site investigation. A review of prior field studies and recent aerial photography indicated that the subject property does not exhibit freshwater wetlands supporting hydraulic features. They noted there are no signs of standing or running water on the subject property during Nelson, Pope, and Voorhees inspections, and that the subject property is not in a flood zone. There are no signs of saturated soils within 24 inches of existing grade, water-stained tree trunks or leaf litter, deposits of waterborne debris, or any other indicating factors of wetlands. They also reviewed other agencies' regulatory standards, and Nelson, Pope, and Voorhees stated in the report that the subject property does not possess characteristics of wetlands based upon delineation guidelines of either the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation nor the Army Corps of Engineers. Finally, the Nelson, Pope, and Voorhees report states that under the Southampton Town Code, wetlands are primarily determined based upon vegetation. However, the town wetlands delineation standards also recognize soil identification and saturation, as well as watermarks, drift lines, and staining. Excuse me. Though some town wetlands indicated vegetative species are present in the form of red maples and trace amounts of swamp dewberry, the site is more dominantly characterized as an upland habitat with facultative upland vegetation, well-drained soils, and an absence of hydrologic conditions, within the upper 24 inches of soil strata. Accordingly, the Nelson, Pope, and Voorhees report concludes that the subject property does not contain freshwater wetlands pursuant to the definitions and standards outlined in Chapter 325 of the Southampton Town Code, as well as federal and state freshwater wetland delineation standards and guidelines. That's basically the substance of their report, which coincides with what we've been talking about during the last meeting, coincides with what the other experts that provided testimony here earlier had stated. And Harry, as you said during the last meeting, the board was invited to visit the site. My understanding is that many of the board members did, in fact, do that. So at this point, I guess the applicant would like to hear of the board's impressions, observations, or comments with respect to their visit on site, or any other questions that they might have.
We're going to get to that in a minute.
Okay.
Have you finished your presentation?
I finished mine, yes.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, is there anyone on Zoom who wants to speak on this
I
application?
know Dr. Abrams may be, he's in he's in England, so he's a little ahead in time, and he was going to try and do it unless, of course, he...
He should be sleeping by now.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a distinct possibility, but I don't know if, could see if he's...
We do have him on, but he hasn't raised his hand, so I'm going to add him.
Okay, Daphne?
Okay, so I guess he's there.
Daphne, do you want to speak?
Daphne as well would like to speak.
Uh,
Yeah, see if you go to sleep.
Kevin, if he's ready to speak, we're ready to listen.
Okay, I'll add him.
And let me know when he's on.
Hello, Dr. Ron Abrams. I believe you can hear me.
We can hear you. And just as a preview, we are continuing the hearing on 48 White's Lane, as you know. And what's important for us tonight is to hear new information. If you have something new that would help us, we'd like to hear that. If it's repeating things you said before, it does us no good.
I have submitted a statement in response to the last hearing, and I have a short statement I'd like to make now, if you're willing to hear it. Not entirely new, but I think it may clarify some points that I think are important, if you're willing to hear that.
All right, go ahead.
My comments are that I want to reinforce the fact that wetland habitats are comprised of plants that exhibit a competitive advantage because they thrive in anaerobic conditions. Such conditions are created by saturated soils where normal oxygen required for life of ordinary plants is not available. Wetland plants live where the moisture in the soil resides for at least 3 or more weeks within the top 18 inches. This condition does not exist at 48 White's Lane because the water table is more than 9 feet below the surface. The soils are sandy, so rain and snow melt drain away. So there is no anaerobic habitat within the topsoil layers. Mr. Shea, in prior hearing, attempted to create the impression that such conditions could exist at the site in either geological history or perhaps in the future. Such conditions will not happen at this site in our lifetimes or even by the next century, because a change in the water table of an elevation of 7 to 9 feet would require sea level rise of far more than is predicted. And if such flooding ever occurs, a lot of Southampton will be underwater. Please think about this. Mr. Shea tried to convince us that maybe because of the moderate drought of the past 20 years, the water table dropped by 7 to 9 feet and that it could come back. If this happened, so much of the town would be, well, if it dropped by 7 to 9 feet, so much of the town would be dried out, your coastline would have receded, and your potable water supply would have been devastated. None of this happened, and it won't happen. Sea level rise is happening, but not at the rate that will result in the changes intimated by Mr. Shea. And I just want that realistic perspective to be reinforced. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Daphne?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marty.
Daphne Vaughn, Surfside Environmental Planning. So, since the last meeting on March 8th, I've been back out to the site 3 more times, the last time being last Friday, May 5th. And I continue to note the presence of multiple fallen or dead red maples at the site and the emergence of additional American holly and the perennial Canada Mayflower, both listed as facultative upland species, and both previously noted in my November 9th report and a multitude of photographs that I previously submitted throughout the seasons. So in my many visits to the site, I continued to note lots of lumps and bumps on a lot of the red maples, and I wanted to understand why that was occurring. So I decided to do a little bit of research into that. And I found that those lumps are called burls. And burls are a defense mechanism by trees that results in the overgrowth that is caused from some form of a stress to the tree or an infection. And in most cases, burls can be caused by an infection by bacteria or fungus or some kind of insect. However, there's not a lot of information out there about this in what I was able to find. But in going back to the site to re-review this, many of the maples located within the delineated wetlands by the town contain multiple burls, denoting that a stress was inflicted upon those trees, as you can see in the photos that I submitted. One of them being the one that recently fell by White's Lane. So burls can occur both above and below ground, but they don't necessarily harm the tree from growing. They can sometimes cause them to fall, depending on their size and the location on the tree themselves. But lastly, I wanted to note, as you can see on my first page, on the bottom right, that stand of 12 to 15 foot high invasive ailanthus or tree of heaven that is taking root in the front of the property, which is further supporting the successional nature of the property, because it's locally known as an invasive tree that grows generally in poor soils and drought-tolerant conditions. So that's all. I just wanted to give you my insight and show you some of the examples on the property of these trees that have undergone some form of a stress throughout their lifespan.
Thank you, Daphne.
You're welcome.
I just want to tie things up. We've seen an awful lot, we've heard an awful lot. We've had a lot of documents here, and I believe every board member has visited, or just about every board member has visited the site. So there's a great deal of familiarity with that site. I want to summarize what I've heard and seen from staff, from the applicant, others, from board members. And then I want to just ask to see test me if I'm accurate, if that's what you see also. And then we'll make a decision of where we go next with this. So on this property, we've seen this property as a board many, many times with applications in this area. And it was flagged back in 2001 as wetlands. The more recent flagging is diminished, but it was still flagged as wetlands. So there's a long history of wetlands on this property. So what we've heard, though, is that the applicant has given us some information about why there's no longer wetlands. So when I visited the site, I also noticed a lot of what I characterize as unhealthy red maples, although there are still a bunch of red maples there, and a lot of other species. So there is a history of wetlands on the property. But the definition of wetlands in Chapter 325 gives a lot of different plant communities that can be classified as wetlands. And what's characteristic of all of them is that they're there because of wet conditions at some point. So it's likely that on this property, at some point in the history, there were wet conditions. And probably in 2001 when they were flagged, and likely more recently. I believe the year was 2010 when the applicant offered that the town had done some drainage work on the road, and that may have altered what was going on there. We've seen other places where when houses are constructed, sometimes clay blends can be broken through, it can change the hydrology. We don't have all the answers to that. We don't need to have all the answers to that. But what we do see is that this is likely a property that is not the same as it was 20 years ago. So the test is, to determine if they're wetlands, are there wetlands there? Are the indicator species there because soils are, as the code calls, are they seasonally or permanent flooding or sufficiently waterlogged soils to give them a competitive advantage over other species? And it seems like this is an area that has transitioned from wetlands to not wetlands anymore. So it no longer supports, as a competitive advantage, wetland indicative species. There are other species growing there now. They're likely to continue, and that ratio is likely to change towards upland species as we go forward. If we look across the street on the town preserved land, it looks very different, a very dense understory. The skunk cabbage, the standing water. There's still red maples. They're there for a different reason. They're there because there are flooded soils. There are waterlogged soils. We don't see that in this property. So I believe the conclusion that we would reach as this board is that we would agree with the applicant that there are not wetlands on this property. So now I invite you to confirm or add or subtract what I've said to add more to the discussion.
I confirm what you say. You know, I've been there. I noticed the same thing about the plants and the growth. I also saw standing water on the town-owned property, you know, across the road. Nothing on the property that's in question. I think that there probably were wetlands there, and whether it was the construction of the road or the building that changed the hydrology of the land, as you said, it doesn't really matter, but somewhere along the line it happened, and I don't think we can make a decision on what may be 20 or 30 years ago. If, you know, we have to look at it now, and I don't think that there's wetlands there.
Anyone else?
Nothing to add, I agree.
Yeah, agreed. I didn't have the opportunity to go over there too, so.
Yeah, we went together,
Yeah, mhm.
Sunshine and I.
Would someone like to make a motion to close the hearing?
Mo- Motion to close the public hearing?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Thank you. That was done?
Good night.
You're welcome.
Advisory reports. Trustees, Sunset Point Enterprises LLC.
Marty Shea, Chief Environmental Officer for the town. This, as indicated, is a referral from the Board of Trustees for residentially developed property at 130 Point Nicholas Lane in the hamlet of Bridgehampton. I did have an opportunity to inspect the property, and these are my recommended advisory comments. A May 2nd, 2023 Environment Division field inspection of the proposed catwalk / dock location has revealed that both the state and town regulated wetlands and adjacent Swan Creek shorelands have been cleared and modified by soil and loam deposition for the purposes of establishing lawn. The affected areas are encumbered by a covenanted naturally vegetated wetland non-disturbance, non-fertilization buffer, the entirety of which has been largely destroyed. Accordingly, the plans that were submitted by First Coastal Corporation are not reflective of current site conditions. Second, this provides some history. Administrative wetland permit application number WAA 23025 had separately been filed with the town on March 17, 2023 in order to seek approval to manage existing phragmites. However, permitting of such activities is not being entertained, as the application and plans needs to be modified to call for a full reclamation of the pre-existing natural terrain and vegetative cover. Thirdly, in light of the above, any permitting of the planned catwalk and dock should be held in abeyance until the affected shorelands have been fully restored. And I will note that the aerial photograph that you're looking at was taken prior to the unauthorized clearing. That natural vegetation that you see on the lower terrain between the residence pool and the creek. The majority of that has been cleared.
Motion to send these comments to the trustees.
Second?
And Karina, I just wanted to mention there's a typo on comment 1. Soil and loam.
Yeah, I see that. Right.
You got it, Marty?
It's been moved to send these comments to the trustees. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The administrative wetland permits are in your packets. Resolution of conditional approval. A021094 51 NPL LLC. Any discussion?
Move to issue.
Second?
Resolved that a conditional wetland permit approval be granted to 51 MPL LLC for the proposed project by the terms and conditions set forth therein. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? A022028 Denise Sokolich, and this is postponed to May 24th.
Motion to postpone until May 24th, 2023.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? A022044 Michael Hausman, any discussion?
Move to issue.
Second?
Resolved that a conditional wetland permit approval granted to Michael Hausman for the proposed project upon the terms and conditions set forth therein. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? A022058 Francis Torres and Yvonne Torres, any discussion?
Move to issue.
Second.
Resolved that a conditional wetland approval be granted to Francisco Torres and Yvonne Torres for the proposed project upon the terms and conditions set forth therein. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? A022092 Scott Levinson, any discussion?
Move to issue.
Second?
Resolved that a conditional wetland approval be granted to Scott Levinson for the proposed project upon the terms and conditions set forth therein. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? A022095 91 Cobb Isle LLC, any discussion?
Move to issue.
Second?
Resolved that a conditional wetland approval be granted to Cobb Isle LLC for the proposed project by the terms and conditions set forth therein. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Preliminary review seeker determination A021076 Nicholas Christopher and Penelope Christopher, postponed to May 24th.
Motion to postpone until May 24th, 2023.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? A022012 Duretti Fufa, postponed to May 24th.
Motion to postpone until May 24th, 2023.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? A022017 Gary DeLiva and others.
Good evening again. I'm Marty Shea, Chief of Environmental Analyst for the town. This application relates to an existing residentially developed property at Pine Court in the Hamlet of Northampton. There is a preliminary advisory report on file dated May 3rd, 2023. The applicant had been cited for unauthorized activities at the property and has filed this application in order to legalize a treated wood retaining wall and various other changes that have been made to the property. This is an application for which significant additional information is needed in order to make a determination. As such, recommending that a public hearing be held.
Motion to schedule a public hearing for June 28th, 2023.
Second?
Resolved that the Town Conservation Board hereby schedules a public hearing for June 28th, 2023, and that a notice of public hearing be published in the town designated newspaper pursuant to Chapter 325, Section 325-8C of the Town Code. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? A022045 Edward McCormick and Margaret McCormick.
This application relates to an existing residentially developed property in West Hampton. The application has been made in order to gain this board's approval. We'll go forward with various accessory and hardscape improvements that include a number of patios, walks, a small hot tub, some deck replacement, some site restoration is also being planned. The preliminary advisory report on file dated May 2nd, 2023 is supportive of the application, but recommends that the existing covenanted buffer be expanded, and offers that the applicant needs to come forward with a native revegetation plan. The applicant is amenable to those suggested mitigative measures. So we do have sufficient information, make a determination. Consequently, the public hearing requirement can be waived.
Motion to waive the public hearing.
Second.
Resolved that the Town Conservation Board hereby waives the public hearing requirement pursuant to Chapter 325, Section 325-8E of the Town Code. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? A 022055, Stephen Birkenfield and is that the right name? Nicey Birkenfeld, sorry. Stephen Birkenfeld and Nicey Birkenfeld.
This application relates to existing residentially developed property in Remsenburg that has very extensive uplands. There is a preliminary advisory report on file dated May 9, 2023. The applicant is seeking to build a minor living area and garage addition to the house by squaring off the existing residence. The applicant has agreed to various suggested wetland impact mitigative measures, inclusive of conversion of the existing ornamental landscape areas to native vegetation. They're also eliminating existing lawn where pesticides were recently applied, as they pose a risk to the proximate wetlands. During my several inspections, I found that the applicant at some point had commenced reconstruction of the existing decks and replacement of an elevated pool patio with a deck, as well as renovations to the existing elevated pool. The work was being accomplished using treated wood. I contacted the landowner immediately, and consistent with my recommendation, they stopped the work and are also amenable to disassembly of all the partially reconstructed decks and replacement of the treated wood with untreated wood. That would be that would include not only deck boards but posts and joists as well. That is particularly important at this site because it's a very wet site, and the decks are within close proximity to wetlands. So the applicant has agreed to all of the various mitigative measures that I have recommended. I have no issue with minor expansion of the home. There is sufficient information to make a determination. As such, recommending that the hearing requirement be waived.
Motion to waive the public hearing.
Second.
Resolved that the Town Conservation Board hereby waives the public hearing requirement pursuant to Chapter 325, Section 325-80 of the Town Code. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? A 022082, Erlinda Bildner, postponed to May 24th.
So moved.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Resolution issue modification. This is a modification.
Yeah,
No,
this
this is-
wetland permit modification application relates to a new home that's under
Yeah,
construction.
I didn't even announce that. CB 21002, John Petrillo and Victoria Petrillo.
Okay.
I was thinking of something else and I stopped speaking, sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So, again, this application relates to a new home, which is under construction. It's a bayfront residence. This board had issued a wetland permit to allow for demolition of the prior house and construction of the new residence. The applicant came forward with a request to make a minor change in the deck configuration. The deck modifications pose no issue in terms of adverse impacts to wetlands, as the deck area is sufficiently mitigated by a required naturally vegetated wetland non-service non-fertilization buffer that is being restored at the site. So in order for the applicant to complete construction and to close out the wetland and building permits, they need a modified permit. So this is a resolution for the board to approve the requested modified wetland permit to allow them to go forward and finish the residence.
Motion to issue modification?
Second.
Resolved that a wetlands permit modification be issued to John and Victoria Petrillo for the proposed project upon the terms and conditions set forth therein. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
All right, thank you.
Thank you all.
Yep.
You?
Everyone, have a good night.
You too.
Good week.
Good night, all.